Hello, everyone. Welcome to the WookieCast. We're here today with Alexander Freed, the author of several Star Wars novels. So thank you for sitting down with us today.
Thank you for having me here.
So this interview is focused on Reign of the Empire, The Mask of Fear. It does have spoilers, and or it may have spoilers, but I highly suspect it will. So do be careful if that's something you care about. And let's get into it. I'd love to get into what your first Star Wars memory is, the first Star Wars you can remember.
Yeah, I mean going back a ways, like the first Star Wars I actually remember, and I'm sure, memory is such you know, it changes over the years. I'm sure if I were to go back in history and actually assess this, I'm sure I would be wrong, but the first thing I actually remember is probably The Empire Strikes Back on video cassette on a rented VCR. Back in the days when there were video cassettes and when you didn't necessarily even own a VCR, you had to rent one. And just the faintest sort of flickerings of yeah, taken in, yeah, science fiction space opera glory on a small screen TV. But yeah, I really fell in love with it as a kid, and the memories get a lot clearer from there.
Um, what's the first Star Wars film you saw in theaters, if you remember?
First, that I'm not actually sure. It might have been Phantom Menace. It would have been long after my first experiences. I'm not that young, but yeah, my first actual theater memory is Phantom Menace.
So you've been writing for the Star Wars universe for many years. What would you say is one of your favorite parts about it?
There's there's a lot going for it. Certainly it's a universe in which it would have been hard for me to be doing this long if there weren't so many different kinds of stories that you can tell within Star Wars. Right? Like you can do the, very sort of epic fairy tale fantasy. You can do the very grounded political stories. You can do the war stories. There's a lot of tones and themes that the franchise supports. So, it gives you a lot of room to play. So that's been really important. But also there's a lot to be said for knowing that there's an audience out there who's interested in this material, right? Like getting to write something for people who want it is an enormous privilege, and it's a relatively rare thing as a writer. So yeah, I'm always happy to be involved in the Star Wars project for those reasons.
So The Mask of Fear is interesting because it has a lot of characters that people would know if they'd watched the movies, like Mon Mothma and Bail Organa. But there's also a few new characters, like let me see if I don't botch the pronunciation, Chemish, Haki, and Sujin that were introduced. What was your process for developing their character arcs?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky with a project like this because at the start, Lucasfilm and Random House Worlds came with the overall concept of the trilogy, right? Three books, these time periods. This first one going to be in the time after Revenge of the Sith, and focusing throughout the trilogy on Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Saw Gerrera, which sort of lays a lot of foundational pillars in place that you can't then move. So all of the other characters sort of develop in response to those things, right? You go, all right, here's the core of this. What are the themes that I want to deal with? What are the arcs of these central characters? And then how do I want to reflect those back in various ways? How do I want to respond? What do I need to fully flesh this out? So, dealing with a character like Saw, and given the time period as a whole, like it it felt necessary to have a separatist character in there. It felt necessary to have a separatist point of view. It's so deeply tied to who Saw is. There are, it's tied into the politics. So yeah, so there's going to be a separatist character, and once you've sort of got that part, you can start building it out. But yeah, I think all of the, hockey, likewise, it made sense to have an intelligent aspect of the story. Chemish, we needed some sort of, more average person perspective than we were getting from the rest of the cast. So yeah, it's about seeing where the needs are and yeah, creating the tool set to tell the overall story.
That is kind of really important though, because honestly, the senators are pretty off in their own world. You know, they live in very high society, I guess. They mean
Yeah.
well, but
No, absolutely. The senators are in their own world, and Saul is in his own world too, right? Like Saw's not spending a lot of time, talking to the average folk, and yeah, I mean, and it's yeah, everyone has their own little compartmentalized silos in the Star Wars world, and for a book like this, which really is kind of about the era as much as the characters, you want to cover as much ground as possible.
was it kind of a struggle to weave in existing elements into the time period? Because, or well, there's a lot of references to this time period in other media. What was your process for researching and like inserting little things to tie it together?
Well, I did in fact spend a lot of time on Wookieepedia. That was a good primary source of like, okay, what exactly happened in that episode of The Bad Batch that I like half remember? And yeah, so a lot of just sort of figuring out so many little things that Bale does during that time period, so much stuff covered in Bad Batch, yeah, there's a lot of sources for this particular time period, most of which didn't bear directly on the story at hand, but you want to get the timeline right, right? Like you want to make sure everything functions as a single coherent continuity machine. You know, for the big stuff, obviously, Lucasfilm, of course, was extremely helpful. We had good conversations early on, sort of laying out the groundwork of, all right, like what's the timeline of those first few months kind of look like?
You
But
wouldn't want Leia to be too old or something like that. Because
yeah,
her, yeah.
yep. Yeah, no, and there were conversations about like, okay, like how old exactly is Mom's daughter and what needs to be the timeline there? Because yeah, yeah, it's always a thing, and you wanna get it right without having it overwhelm the rest of the story.
Of course. That does kind of lead into one of my questions that I had a bit lower down. I was curious. There's a bit of a plot point where it almost seems like Lita, th this is around the time period in which she would have like almost been born, and there's a scene near the end of the book where that's kind of implied. Is that what happened there, or do you think it happens later?
I mean, it was certainly I don't want to lock
That's
down
fair.
anything that's not in the text of the book. Certainly in my head, that was a yes, this could be the moment of conception. But yeah, don't build any timelines off of that.
Hey, I'm just glad that a lot of other kind of media was pulled in, like them getting arrested. That was definitely something and other things.
I'd forgotten about, yes, that was a whole research project on its own and a couple of conversations with editors in Lucasfilm about, okay, what do we know about the arrests of senators after Order 66? Like how severe was this? Who do we feel comfortable naming? Like what? Yeah, there was that was its own little knot of complexity, and hopefully managed to resolve all of that in a way that feels right to people who actually know this stuff incredibly well.
Tom makes an effort to chat to us sometimes, so we dropping lots of little tidbits everywhere. Um, The next thing, one of our editors wanted to ask, Chemish, they were curious if Chemish was intended to be non-binary.
Yeah, so I mean, two answers to that. The short answer is yes. The long answer is I certainly picture Chemish as non-binary. What Chemish thinks of themselves is a larger question that we don't dive super deeply into within the text of the book, right? Like gender and people's conceptions of their own gender identity is so culturally based, and what does it mean to be non-binary within sort of this part of Coruscant, within this area of the galaxy, within the galactic culture as a whole? Like what does gender mean to these people, let alone like, yeah, where does Chemish categorize themselves? So again, not wanting to speak too much beyond what is on the page, and if someone wants to write a beautiful, Ursula Le Guin Left Hand of Darkness-esque exploration of gender within the Star Wars galaxy in the future. I would I would hate to say anything now that would contradict that. But certainly in my head, my shorthand was yes, Chemish, non-binary, non-binary.
Of course. I'm fairly sure they just asked so they could know whether to edit it in or not. You know us, we're just trying to update the site, constantly
Yes,
in
and
battle.
my job is to give lengthy, non-committal answers that explore my labyrinthine thoughts. So yes, an eternal war between Wikipedia precision and authorial wanderings.
Um, Next, I'd love to get into that. It was really interesting to see Mon and Bale kind of go their separate ways for a time, in pursuit of them having different motivations. I guess they really split over the Jedi, even though they were really close to Padme both. Um, how was that kind of developed? Because obviously it was needed for them to go separate directions in the story, so they weren't just both sitting in the Senate, right? But how'd that come about?
I mean that's certainly part of the seed of it, right? Was looking at, again, if the project is about, in substantial form, this set of three characters, and you've got two of them, Mon and Bale, as sitting senators largely aligned with one another at this point in time, then you need to figure out where the actual drama is coming from. So yeah, I mean, a lot of thinking about like, okay, so what story are we trying to tell, and why is this going to be interesting to be focusing on these two characters? And it seemed to me that one, in the real world, you have plenty of people who could be aligned in their long-term political goals, but really very much aren't. Like that is not a rare occurrence. It felt like creating that tension was going to be meaningful in the work. There was also an aspect of thinking about the time period. We're in spoiler territory, so I can say all this. I didn't want to tell a story too much about this group of people going up against the Empire, because it wasn't going to work out. Like, obviously, that's an element of the story, but I didn't want it to be, oh, who's going to win between, Mon and Tarkin, or some other setup like that. Partly because, yeah, we kind of all know the outcome. Partly because it's not particularly unique to the era. And so structurally, I kind of came at the book from a, what if all of these people who should be working together are just getting in one another's way? right? Saw is getting in Bale's way. Bale is getting in Mon's way. Mon is kind of getting in Saw's way. What if they were their own worst enemies? And that felt very right for a novel driven by politics in an era of confusion before there was an actual rebellion. That was a very long and wandering answer, but I hope that that's interesting to someone.
Yeah, for sure, because the Empire is pretty fragile, but also yet I don't think that they would have been able to like strike back immediately, you know? Not really, not at that point.
Yeah, no. Well, and there's not an appreciation for what striking at the Empire even would look like at this point, right? Like, Bale's the only one who actually knows that the Emperor is an evil sorcerer and not just a corrupt politician. So yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any favorite aspect of Mon's character, having focused a lot on her, especially her personal backstory?
I think the thing, and I've written her a number of times before, both in novels and in short stories. I think one of the things that really appeals to me about her is she is she is a person who embraces her own contradictions and hypocrisies and gets power from them in a way that is, I think, really interesting. So she is simultaneously a pacifist and someone who is leading a war effort. She is, both a lifelong politician and she is someone who begins a revolution and breaks all laws. She is someone who is very comfortable doing the backroom deal making that politics often entails. And you can view that as a character flaw, but it's also a source of strength for her and her ability to live with those internal contradictions and find meaning in them at the same time that she wrestles with them, I think makes her a really compelling character to write.
It was really interesting, a little bit explored into the transgender marriage traditions, actually. Was that a detail kind of expounded on from Andor?
Yeah, so yeah, there was a ton of little bits that came from Andor. Obviously, all of the relationship between her and Perrin, which was a delight to write. Frankly, I wasn't quite sure going in where that was where what I was going to feel about that. But that gave a lot of grist for some interesting drama. Yeah, obviously her cultural backstory. There was a lot to pull from there that I hadn't had in previous depictions of writing her.
And then I guess Bale is less, he's also kind of struggling personally because he's not spending a lot of time with his family. What was writing that dynamic like? Because he's obviously a new father. He has every right to just stay home and basically do nothing, right? He's rich, he senator, he could probably just stay home. Uh,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Bale was interesting for me because Saw and Mon I had both worked with as characters before. And obviously, the original characters didn't have a lot of there was no existing backstory to worry about. Bale was the character who of that trio had far more discussions with Lucasfilm and the folks at Random House about in terms of getting a feel for, okay, where does he actually stand? My very first sort of notes on him and approaches to him were less family focused. Not I didn't forget that he had a wife and kid at home, but just in terms of the tone and where his plot line was exploring. And I got quickly corrected of like, no, like this is a man for whom his family is the center of his world. I'm like, okay, I can work with that. But it yeah, it took some adjustment to and calibration to get that right. Fortunately, I think by the time I actually started writing, we were largely on the in the right ballpark. But yeah, it took me a little while to get my head fully around that character.
I love his idealism. There's this one scene where he goes into the safe and he gets some credits and he's like, "Oh, I'm just go do this. Like, you don't think you're gonna get mugged? Does anything for this is a bad idea?"
Yeah, like that Bale is at this point in time, and he gets there over the course of the timeline, but he's not great at operational security, right? Like this is not his area playing spy games and going undercover. Like, no, like you're a rich guy who's very, very rarely had to worry about this sort of thing, and you're going at it with all the right intentions, but there's a reason why, hockey is kind of running circles around him for a while. It's not that he's dumb, it's not that he's naive, it's that this is new. Like he's never lived under an, autocracy before. And yeah, understandable that he takes a little while to figure out what he's doing.
It is kind of interesting reading about hockey, kind of like trailing him and other people because I don't know, she's a very interesting character. So was she kind of created as a counterpoint to Bale's trying to put two together with him?
Yeah, I mean she's a little bit of the realist perspective next to his idealism. There's also just an aspect of it felt like intelligence work was going to be relevant and messy in the time period. She gave us a perspective inside the Imperial machine, which none of the other characters had quite as much. But yeah, playing her against Bale, both ideologically, but also just in terms of their practical approaches to things it was just kind of a source of fun in large part, right?
Yeah, for sure. And they go on like an adventure together of sorts, which I guess she signed up for, kind of, but
She signed up for, well,
not
neither of
quite
them
that much,
really.
but a little
Yeah.
bit.
She thought he was going to be easier to control, and he didn't quite know the extent of what he was getting into. So yeah, surprises all around.
Um, But Saw is a really interesting character when they meet him because he almost seemed like he was grieving a little bit. I know he lost his sister in the Clone Wars television series, and I guess he's still struggling with that. So how did you go about developing him in this time period? Because I know you wrote the novelization for Rogue One, so you had t a chance to work with him before.
Yeah, I mean it's really all of the characters are grieving in various ways in this book, right? Like whether they're grieving family, grieving the Jedi, grieving the loss of the Republic, grieving the loss of the Separatists. Like they're all dealing with that in various forms. Saw, as I'm sure anyone who's read the book has noticed, portrayed largely through other people's eyes in this book. Sojin most of all, but also we get a lot of Bale perspective on him. We get sort of Hockey making her own assessment of him. And yeah, it felt like Saw was a character where getting other people's reads on him felt more meaningful than getting a long look in his head at this particular time. We've seen some of what he's doing, in sources like Bad Batch, and obviously we got a slightly earlier version of Saw in Clone Wars. Um, he's not he's not on a wildly different path than he is later on. Um, so getting more of an exploration from an outsider's perspective of what sort of person would be would be doing this at this time. I've used the phrasing elsewhere, like what sort of person is the first person to pick up a gun in a crisis? And, how do you look at that person? Even if they end up being right, like what sort of person does that, and how do other people interpret their actions? And it felt like there was a lot of drama there that I wanted to dig into, which is sort of why Saw is in the position he is in the book.
To your point about who picks up the weapon first, it's kind of a moral dilemma because, like Cassian said in Rogue One, like, we've done so much for the rebellion. It has to be worth it, right? Because you're doing so much kind of bad things, like assassinating people and doing all this sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and it's something that you know one of the themes running through the book, or one of the sort of central elements of the setting, is the Clone Wars are over. This is the end of the worst period that anyone has ever experienced for a long, long time. Um, the galaxy had not seen war in ages, and peace is a wonderful and precious thing. So the thought of immediately starting another civil war is something that is just anathema to most of the characters in the setting, but not Saw. And so yeah, that says a lot about Saw. And obviously, like, Mon and Bale get there eventually. But deciding, like, okay, how long are we going to try every other option? How long are we going to hold out for a non-violent solution? And even, like, what does a violent solution look like? There are degrees there, and of course we know where Saw ends up on that scale.
Yeah, and then I guess eventually the Empire does more crimes over time. So I know at the beginning, maybe some normal citizens maybe didn't even notice the difference. They just thought, well, the fighting stopped. Maybe it's
Yeah,
fine.
absolutely. And that's sort of Chemish's role within the story, is, someone who can go, look, like, this this seems okay. Like, you can argue about politics, but fundamentally, like, that guy got us out of a war. Um, what are we doing here? And yeah. Yeah, and it's a lot easier to choose to pick up a gun and decide to fight your own government when there's a Death Star blowing up planets. Right? At that point, the moral calculus becomes a lot easier. But when it's week one and the shooting has just stopped, it's trickier.
I guess this kind of puts it at it was much different maybe writing this novel compared to the other novels, such as the Alphabet Squadron trilogy and Battlefront Twilight Company, because those were fighting the Empire for most of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is I was talking about this to someone a while ago. This is a fairly rare Star Wars novel that takes place at a time of peace. It's not that there are none of them. You go back, to the pre-Clone Wars time. They are out there, but there aren't a lot of Star Wars stories that are in the, like, yeah, it's not going to get a lot more or less, it's not going to get a lot more peaceful moving forward or moving backwards, but in this particular moment, yeah. And Twilight Company is of course at the absolute heart of the war, and so it's largely examining questions of what does it mean to fight in a war? Why do we fight? What are the different motivations? What are the moral calculuses there? Alphabet Squadron is more interested in how long do you keep fighting the war, right? Like, when is a war actually over, and what does it mean to the people? So yeah, this rolls it all back to the very beginning, to the questions of when do you start a war?
Like, when do you start a war? And one of the Alphabet Squadron trilogy novels had like a moment where a character was like, "This is morally wrong. Like, I was ordered to do this, but it's morally wrong." So I think it's a really interesting thing when you have to kind of struggle against orders like that. Um,
I mean, I do. I hope the readers do as well. And it's yeah, it's one of the nice things that Star Wars supports is you can do the moments of absolute moral purity. Like there's no question about Luke going up against the Emperor, right? Like yeah, we know what's going on there. There's not a lot of gray area, but you can find gray areas in the setting, and those can be fun to play in.
um, Actually, it's kind of interesting to note. Most of the Battlefront Twilight Company articles on Wikipedia are entirely done, which is pretty, I mean, impressive considering most of Wikipedia is not done. Um,
I did not know that. That does strangely please me.
yeah, if you look up any topic down to the smallest unidentified character, it's probably done. Um,
There are a lot of unidentified and bit characters in that book too.
I think
That
it's several hundred pages that one of my friends wrote. Um, Big fan of that novel. I know this interview was focused on the Mask of Fear, but if you had one favorite thing about Battlefront Twilight Company that you'd love to share, I'd love to hear it from you.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, I did not come in prepared for that question.
Most honest answers come when they're unprepared.
I mean, I'm pleased with that book, right? Like I have not reread it. I don't reread my own work. It would drive me mad. But I do love just the cast of soldiers in that world, right? Like everything from the big ones to the tiny little sort of, you know, characters who keep popping up every 50 pages or so, like Carver and Twitch. So yeah, I think it's the company itself and all of the folks in it that yeah. Yep.
Thank you. He'll appreciate it. So, um, lastly, if there's one thing you could tell people to perhaps inspire them to pick up the Mask of Fear soon, what would it be?
Yeah. I think like if you are in the market for a politically driven Star Wars thriller that feels like it's interested in some real depth to the themes of living under an autocracy and feels like it's in a conversation with the real world in some ways. Like I hope it's a book that you would enjoy. Oh, and if you're a fan of Andor, that's an important that's the official marketing line, but don't want to forget that one. But yeah, the first part too.
What social media platforms can people find you on if they'd like to keep up with you and your work?
I'm not particularly good at keeping my social media up to date, but I have been on Blue Sky recently, so I encourage people to find me at Alexander M. Freed. My website has not been updated in a very long time, but there is still some you know there's bibliographies of you know the books and video games and so forth that I've worked on, as well as articles on the craft of writing that are hopefully timeless to some degree, and that's alexanderfreed.com.
All right, thank you so much for sitting down with us. It was a pleasure to have you, and I'm also personally really glad to hear that you used Wikipedia at some points. It's great.
Yeah, I do not know where I would be without Wookieepedia. Thank you for having me on, and yes, it was great fun.